What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video. Today we're going to be going over two-handed builds, what gear you're going to want to cover, as well as just sort of generic stuff that you're going to want to have for a two-handed build that is pretty much class agnostic. These would include things like your CP points for the most part, attributes, what kind of food you want to run, what kind of money you want to run, things like that. So if you're interested in knowing specific builds for each of the different classes, I would recommend taking a look down the description below for those specific class videos. Those should be released over the course of this coming week here. So even though you do see that I am on a Stamsork, for example, this video will not be covering what sort of skills or the rotation of a Stamsork. That is reserved for the Stamsork specific videos. Again, this is just how I am breaking up all of my build videos moving forward from now on. So today we're just going to be going over gear as well as all this sort of class agnostic information. So two-handed builds, really quickly, just sort of a cursory look at where two-handed builds sort of stand in relation to dual-wield builds for stamina DPS. Two-handed DPS in terms of single target does fall a little bit short of where dual wield is. That doesn't mean that two-handed builds are necessarily bad. They can still pull very good DPS, single target DPS with a two-handed build, but the dual wield builds do have a higher DPS ceiling, so most endgame DPS players are going to be running a dual wield build for single target boss fights. Where two-handed builds really shine is their AoE potential, so dual wield builds kind of fall behind a little bit here when it comes to AoE potential. So for boss fights where cleave is going to be more important, a very good example of this would be fights like Navintas or Lokkestiiz from the latest Sunspire trial, but there are some other fights where you're going to want some more cleave damage compared to just raw single target damage. And that is where two-handed builds really start to stand out. They do have an ability and a couple of passives that really help boost their overall splash damage, giving them much greater AoE potential than single target potential. So what a lot of endgame DPS do is they actually run a two-handed build for trash fights or boss fights where cleave is very important, and then swap over to a dual wield build when they need a single target damage. For PC, it's very easy to do that because we have add-ons that will be able to change our gear out for us for just a single hit of a button. But console players obviously need to go into the inventory and swap out gear manually, so a little bit trickier to do on console, so just keep that in mind if you're a console player taking a look at this video. But enough about that, let's go ahead and get started here with the gear. So this particular setup here is arguably going to give you the best single target setup pretty much across the board. So it's pretty much identical to what you'd see in a dual wield build. Any set that runs well on a dual wield build will generally speaking be very good on a two-handed build as well. So for example, we have Maarselok here as our monster helm set, Relequen as our body set here, and then we have Lokkestiiz as our front bar set. Again, pretty much identical to what you would see in a dual wield build, just with a two-handed weapon, in this case a battle axe, compared to dual wield weapons. We're still running double ravage health poisons here, so damage health poisons 9, and we are still running the Maelstrom bow on the back bar, and as always you can replace this with the Master's bow instead if you don't have access to the Maelstrom bow or you don't have a Maelstrom bow yet. For traits, this is where things are going to be a little bit different, because for a dual wield build you have two weapons, so you have two half strength traits. For a two-handed build you have a single weapon with a full strength trait. Now, the advantage of a dual-wield build is you can have one of those traits be sharpened, and so you only need to put in anywhere between 60 to 62 points into piercing, depending on what sort of jump point you're trying to hit with your other CPs. With a two-handed build, unless you're running a set that has an armor penetration bonus built in, like Tsogvin's for example, you will not be able to hit the penetration cap if you're running something like Precise or Nirnhoned, unless you're a Necromancer. So for most classes, you're going to be running Sharpened as your trait rather than something like Precise, Nirnhoned, or Infused. This is just so you can get up to the penetration cap. Now, because we're running Sharpened, this does mean that your CPs are going to differ too, because if you're running the standard 60s to 62 piercing CPs, you're going to be overpenning by a fair amount, and I think it's about 2k over penetration if you're running Sharpened here. So, for those of you guys who are trying to swap out between two-handed and dual-wield builds for things like trial runs and things like that, just be very mindful of where you want to put your CPs. I believe most CPs kind of focus in more on the 60 to 62, so they do overpen a little bit with two-handed builds, and that's partially because, again, you're doing more cleave damage, and so not all debuffs are going to be applied in a cleaved scenario, so overpenning single target-wise with a two-handed build is a little bit of a good sacrifice because you're gaining some penetration on everything else that's not getting those debuffs like Alkosh and Crusher. Just a little bit of a nuance here, and actually a fairly big difference when it comes to comparing it to dual wield builds. Other than that, everything else remains the same. So you have Bloodthirsty or Infuse for your jewelry traits with weapon damage enchants. Then you have Divines with max stamina enchants for all of our armor, and all of our armor is medium. You can run a single heavy monster helm set if you would like. A single piece of heavy if you want a little bit more health, but most stamina classes should be fine running blue food. That's max health, max stamina food, so you shouldn't need the additional max health from a single heavy piece because the food should be able to get you up to about 17k max health, especially if you're an orc with the additional health from your orc passives. In terms of other sets, like I mentioned, pretty much identical to what you would see from a dual-wield build. So in terms of monster helm sets, starting things off here, we have Velidreth, comes from Cradle of Shadows, pretty tried and true. It's probably a lot easier to run than Maarselok because you don't have to worry about bash weaving with Maarselok. So Velidreth is kind of one of those, like, you can just wear it and not really worry too much about whether it's going to damage anything and kind of remembering when you got to bash. But it is going to be a little bit weaker than Maarselok overall. Part of Maarselok's strength does come from how many debuffs or negative effects you have on the boss. So in groups where you're not able to maintain very good uptimes on your debuffs, Velidreth might actually end up beating out Maarselok, but that is a very case-by-case scenario. Another monster helm set you might want to consider running is going to be Selene's. This is probably going to be best on a Templar, just because Templars use biting jabs. But Selene's does have the capability of out-parsing Velidreth at the very least, because it does proc more often than Velidreth does and deals a little bit more damage. But the downside of Selene's is it is a melee-only set, so if for whatever reason you are not able to stay within melee range of the boss, let's say the boss moves around a lot, like let's say the twins in VMAW, then Selene's isn't going to be quite as good. So just bear that in mind here before you start using Selene's. But Selene's is a potentially strong monster helm set to run here if you're going to be able to stay within melee range and deal that melee damage, and the boss is not moving around too much. Slimecraw is another good set to hold on to for the Minor Berserk. If you're not able to get Minor Berserk from your healers very well, let's say your uptime is only about 33% or something like that, Slimecraw is going to be better to wear compared to some other monster helm sets. The usual cutoff that is recommended to wear Slimecraw is if your Minor Slayer uptime, or Minor Berserk uptime I should say, is lower than 40%, run Slimecraw rather than a damaged monster helm set. That's pretty much it when it comes to monster helm. Not many good stamina monster helm sets to really talk about here. Now in terms of other armor set bonuses, we will go over the different types of armors, starting off with dungeons, then moving on to overland, and then finally closing off with trials. So in terms of dungeon sets, there are a couple of pretty good dungeon sets. I think I already took out some of them, so I'll have to come out of this a little bit. First one's going to be Leviathan, which is basically the stamina version of Mother's Sorrow, so it just gives you a bunch of weapon crit. As a static bonus, you're going to want to wear this on the body if you can. This is a base game set, which comes from Crypt of Hearts. It's not a bad set, but generally speaking, Salmon DPS do have higher weapon crit compared to spell crit on a magic DPS, so not going to be quite as strong. That being said, two-handed builds don't have the equivalent of a dagger for additional crit chance, so Leviathan is a little bit stronger on a two-handed build compared to on a dual-wield build. So it is a potentially good option to run depending on what your other sets are and what your overall crit chance is. Moving on from there, let's see here, where are you? Tsogvin's Warband. This is another potentially good set to run, mainly because it adds that physical penetration bonus on the 4-piece, so you don't have to run Sharpened on your weapon. You can do something like Precise, Nerdhoned, or Infused instead. This comes from Frostbolt, so you do need to have access to that dungeon if you want to farm for this set here. The 5-piece gives you up to 1,290 weapon crit, which ends up being just over 6% additional crit chance, and you also gain minor force, so you don't necessarily need to worry about maintaining your Barb Trap uptime anymore because you're getting the minor force from Tsogvin's. The proc condition is on critical damage, so not that bad to proc. Plus, the buff does last for 10 seconds, so you are able to run this as a front bar set rather than a body set instead. So pretty good options there for Tsogvin's. Next we have overland sets. Not a lot of overland sets to cover here. I don't think there's actually any overland sets really to really cover here in terms of overland. Spriggans might be good for trash fights, just because again you won't necessarily get all the resistance debuffs that you want on all the ads. Things like Alkosh, Crusher, etc. might not be able to be applied, so you might want to run Spriggans, but that is kind of a case-by-case basis for Spriggans Thorns. Beyond that, though, again, not a lot of medium armor sets, overland sets. There's Briarheart, which is potentially good if you need a self-heal. They did take out the 1 second cooldown on the heal, so you can get a lot of heals going at any given time here. In terms of actual weapon damage that it provides, it ends up being, if you calculate out the uptime, it ends up being about equal to Hunding's Rage, so not particularly great. The difference is Hunding's Rage is static, but Briarheart is a proc, so you can wear this on the front bar set. Briarheart is typically not a set I would normally recommend for 12-man content, but if you're running something like 4-man content or you're running something like VMA, the additional heal from Briarheart could be beneficial if your healers are kind of weak or you're running something like 3 DPS, 1 tank. That being said, though, Vigor is usually going to be a better or more reliable self-heal than Briarheart because there is that 5-second downtime between procs for Briarheart. So just keep that in mind before you rely on it for a self-heal. In terms of crafted sets, let's go over to Craft Store. A couple of sets to hold on to here. First one here is going to be Mechanical Acuity. This is a 6 trait set. So from Clockwork City, the 3-piece doesn't do you any favors, it's just spell damage, and you get weapon damage and max stamina. The 5-piece basically gives you a 100% crit chance for 5 seconds every 18 seconds, so pretty decent. It does proc on direct damage, so a little bit tricky to proc depending on the type of damage that you're dealing, but it is a fun set to run around with. It's a 6-piece crafted set, so fairly easy to obtain, so not a terrible set, but there are stronger sets out there. Then there's Hunding's Rage, which is a base game 6 trait set, so anybody can craft this. Doesn't matter if you have access to any sort of DLCs or not. Pretty tried and true, just a flat weapon damage bonus, so much like Leviathan, make sure to have this as a body set. Can't really run this on the front bar very well. Again, because it's crafted, anybody can craft it if you know the 6 traits, or you can get somebody else to craft it for you. And then finally, we have New Moon Acolytes, which comes from Southern Elsewhere. This is a 9 trait set, so might be a little bit more difficult for your newer players to get, because learning 9 traits, I think, takes the better part of about like 3 or 4 months or something like that. But again, you can craft it. You can get somebody else to craft it for you. This gives you a fair amount of additional bonuses, so weapon crit, weapon damage, and it also gives you spell penetration, physical penetration. So much like Zogvin's, you don't need to run sharpened weapons if you're running New Moon Acolyte. Now, the downside of running New Moon is that you do get an increase in your costs of all of your abilities by 5%, which also includes ultimates, so just keep that in mind here. Your sustain is going to take a hit if you run New Moon Acolyte. So this is something that you typically won't be using for long boss fights. This is more for sort of like short trash fights because you get that additional physical penetration as well on that 4-piece. Next, trial sets. We already covered 2 of the most popular ones, which is Relequen and Lokkestiiz. But there are 2 others that I want to mention here. First one is going to be Twice-Fanged Serpent. This is pretty much covers sort of the same niche as Brigands, where if you need additional physical penetration for trash fights, you can run Twice-Fanged Snake. Not very commonly used for boss fights because you don't really need additional penetration anymore. War Machine might be good for either Templars or Stamina Wardens, or possibly even Stamina Nightblades, because you guys have very cheap ultimates. Wardens' cost is 75, Nightblade's cost is 70, and Stamina Templar cost is 72, so pretty cheap ultimates, so you're able to give out Major Slayer to you and your closest 2 allies. Not used very often just because Lokkestiiz also provides Major Slayer and is arguably more consistent, but it could be useful in 4-man content to provide Major Slayer, or if you know people don't have Lokkestiiz, for example, you could run War Machine instead to help buff things up. And then I do want to point out Vicious Serpent, which is good for base game players. So if you don't have access to any of the other trials, you only have access to the 3 Cradle trials, Vicious Serpent is going to be the only way you can get Minor Slayer, so you should be running this set here. It reduces the cost of your stamina abilities by 8%, so it's actually not a bad idea to pair this with New Moon Acolyte, so you can offset the additional cost from New Moon. It's also very stat dense, so you get 3 armor bonuses and Minor Slayer and the additional cost reduction. So it's actually a pretty decent set, all things considered, for a base game set. Obviously, it doesn't match up to Relequen or Lokkestiiz, but, you know, sacrifices here and there. But that pretty much covers it for pretty much all the sets. There are going to be a list of sets down below in the description, categorized by their where you can get them, as well as whether you want to wear them on the body or as a front bar set So again, that's down in the description below. I should have all the sets down there, including probably a few that I probably have missed in this non-exhaustive list that I just went through. Now moving on to other things besides gear, starting off with the character sheet. So in terms of race, pretty identical to dual wields. Basically, orcs and dark elves are going to be your strongest two races because they get additional weapon damage. They get 258 additional weapon damage. Orcs are going to be stronger. They get 2k max stamina and I believe 1k max health, so kind of offsets your survivability a little bit there. Dark elves only get 1875 max stamina, but they also get spell damage and max magicka, so the same amount, so 258 spell damage, 1875 additional max magicka. So if you want to swap out between magicka and stamina DPS, dark elves are going to be the better option because orcs aren't great magic DPS because they only have stamina and weapon damage. So those are going to be your best two races. There are other races you could choose. For example, red guards and wood elves are pretty good in the sustain department, but they lack the additional weapon damage. They both also get 2000 max stamina, so they are stamina races, but your DPS ceiling is going to be lower, but your sustain is going to end up being a lot better because both of those classes have sustain bonuses. Imperials are not a terrible choice either because they get the max stamina, max health, plus they get a little bit of additional cost reduction to all abilities of 3% and an additional sustain bonus. So not terrible for Imperial, but again, they don't get the additional weapon damage bonus, so your DPS ceiling is going to be lower even though your sustain and survivability is going to improve. So you're basically trading off essentially damage for sustain on those last three races. For attributes, all points into stamina. I already mentioned we're going with blue food, which is max health, max stamina, so we should be able to hit 70k max health pretty easily with blue food, so we don't need to run any points of the health. That being said, if you feel squishy, you can put a few points from stamina into health, but I don't recommend shifting too much just because, you know, you're giving up some damage, and the point is to do damage, not necessarily to become kind of this quasi survivable DPS. In most cases, if you're dying a lot, it's usually because you're not doing mechanics right, you're not paying attention to your feet, rather than not having enough health. Mundus is going to be the shadow, nothing really surprising there. If you have low crit chance, you might be better off running the thief, but generally speaking, your weapon crit should be high enough that you should be running the shadow rather than the thief. Then I will be running Lava Foot here for all of our parses, and that's just because that mimics in raid sustain better than running gold food. But in an actual raid environment, you will not obviously be running regen food unless you're a Necromancer. There are certain Necromancers that do that. Speaking, you'll be running max health, max stamina, which is blue food. So I have an example of this here. It gives you max health, max stamina. But it doesn't give you any sort of additional regen. So if you want that sort of balance between health, stamina, and regen, you have two options. First one is going to be Dubus Command Throne. This is the cheaper option, but it's also the weaker option too. So this gives you health, stamina, and stamina regen. The much more expensive option, but also the stronger option, is going to be Artaeum Takeaway Broth. So it gives you more health, gives you more stamina, gives you more stamina regen, also gives you some additional health regen. But again, it doesn't give you quite as much raw stats as blue food does. Blue food gives you 5395 health, 4936 max stamina, and you're missing quite a bit of it. You're missing about 1.6k of both health and stamina here with Artaeum Takeaway Broth. So you are going to give up some DPS potential by running regen food, but you're gaining some regen. So you kind of have to make that trade-off depending on how your group feels. In an organized raid group, you should be able to sustain blue food perfectly fine, but not all raid groups are going to be perfectly optimized, so just keep that in mind here while you're choosing out your food. Next, going over our champion points. So CP setup here, this is assuming you're at max CPs. If you're not at max CPs, try to copy the approximate distribution here. For green CPs, the most important is going to be Mooncalf. For blue CPs, the most important is going to be Piercing, and then you can spread out points from there. And then red CPs, just kind of go for balanced approach or however you want to put your red CPs around. So for your green CPs, we have 100 into Mooncalf, and that is the most important thing to hit, 100 into Mooncalf. The remaining points you can really place however you'd like, so that gives you 170 points to play around with. I have 75 Tenacity, 31 Shadow Word, 31 Tumbling, and 33 into Warlord. But again, the only real important thing you want to hit is 100 into Mooncalf. Everything else can kind of be divided up however you feel like. So you can move some points out of Tenacity, for example, if you know you're not going to heavy attack very often to gain stamina back, and shift them into other nodes that might be more beneficial, like Bashing Focus, so that way you can reduce the cost of bashing with Maarselok. For blue CPs, So this is a generic CP setup here. For Necromancers, you are going to have a little bit of a different setup here just because you do have additional penetration through your Necromancer passives. But for most setups here, this is what you're going to want to run. 64 Mighty, 37 into Piercing, 61 into Precise Strikes, then 52 Thaumaturge, and 56 into Master at Arms. Now you could shift some more points in the Master at Arms here. Generally speaking, two-handed builds, you're going to want to emphasize direct damage because you're running Wrecking Blow, typically speaking. Plus you're also running Executioner, both of which scale off of direct damage. It's pretty much the same concept behind dual wield builds where you want a little bit more into Master at Arms compared to Thaumaturge. Certain classes you might see a little bit of a shift here and there, but generally speaking, you know, you're talking about 1 or 2 percentage points moving around here and there. That's not going to make a huge difference on your DPS. It's all going to be basically within margin of error. So again, this is assuming that you're not running something with an armor penetration bonus like Sogvin's or Numen Acolyte, and you're running a sharpened weapon. If you're a Necromancer or you're running something like Sogvin's, you're going to want to shift your CP points around. So the idea is get enough points to piercing to hit that penetration cap. If you have all your debuffs active, it should be 5850 is what you want to hit for your penetration. So just put enough points into piercing to hit that number, and then shift your points elsewhere, making sure to hit those jump points. So 64, 61, 52, those are examples of jump points on those nodes. Finally, our red CPs, again, this is more of a balanced approach. So you have 81 Ironclad, 61 Thickskin, and 64 in both Hardy and Elemental Defender. So that pretty much covers it for everything you need to know about two-handed builds. Now again, I will have links in the description below to all the class builds. They should be coming out over the course of this week, and I will update the description as those build videos are released. So we're going to be starting off first with the Stamina Sorcerer most likely, and then moving on from there. It should be released every single day, a different class every day, but it's going to be dependent on how much I'm able to get done during my spring break in terms of video production here. And again, there are also not links, but there is down below in the description a list of all the sets that I talked about, probably a few that I missed here, for two-handed builds, as well as where to get them and what sort of position you want to place them in terms of armor, whether they're like front bar sets only or they're body sets only, and so on and so forth. But that concludes this video. If you guys have any questions at all, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.